Alexander the Great conquered the known world in 12 years, and then his empire didn't survive 12 months without him. On this channel, we don't really ask who won the battle. We ask who kept the crown after the general died. The myth is simple enough. Alexander was invincible. He built an empire that spread across 3 continents, and it all came down to his genius, his army, and his will. That's the story stamped on the coin, and it's wrong. An empire built on one man's charisma was never really an empire at all. It was a countdown. The real mechanics of it are colder than that. When Alexander died in Babylon with no heir and no plan, his generals didn't inherit an empire. They inherited a corpse, and they started carving it up. One of them, a man named Ptolemy, took the smallest and strangest piece of the whole thing, which was Egypt. And instead of ruling it like some conquered province, he did something that none of the other generals thought to do. He put on the pharaoh's crown, he funded the old temples, and he started minting the Egyptian gods right on his coins. He didn't destroy the old machine. He climbed inside it, and he turned the key. He didn't just take the throne, he borrowed the legitimacy that was already sitting on it. By the end of this, you won't just know how Egypt outlasted Alexander's death by nearly 3 centuries. You'll know the exact method every occupying power since has used to make conquest look like continuity. Welcome back to Hidden Forces in History. I'm your host, Jeremy Ryan Slate, CEO of Command Your Brand. You can check us out over at commandyourbrand.com. Now, our story. To understand what Ptolemy built, you first have to understand what he watched fall apart. Alexander died in Babylon in June of 323 BC, and he was 32 years old. By then, he'd conquered Persia, Egypt, the Levant, most of the Iranian plateau, and pieces of Central Asia and India. 12 straight years of campaigning, more territory than any single human being in history had ever conquered. He left behind nothing to actually run it. No adult heir, no named successor, no plan of any kind for what happens the day after the general dies. If you ask the men in Alexander's inner circle what the empire actually was, the honest answer is the empire was Alexander. It lived in his person, in his army, in his reputation, in this ability to somehow be in 5 places at once through sheer force of will. So the moment you take him out of the equation, there's no equation left. Within a year, his generals were at each other's throats. Historians call it the Wars of the Diadochi, the successors, which is a very polite name for a decades-long knife fight over the corpse of an empire. And within a generation, almost nothing coherent was left of what Alexander had built. Almost nothing, except in one place, and that place was Egypt. One general took the smallest, strangest piece of the whole thing, and instead of fighting to hold all of it, he did something that nobody else even considered. He decided to keep just his piece and make it permanent. His name was Ptolemy, son of Lagos, and he'd been with Alexander since they were children. He wasn't some hired sword or some distant governor. He was one of the inner circle. One of the men who marched from Macedon all the way down to India and back. So when the empire cracked open, Ptolemy moved fast. And the way he moved tells you everything about how his mind worked. He didn't just march on Babylon and to grab the center. He didn't try to inherit the whole machine. He took Egypt, which was rich, defensible, sealed off by desert on nearly every side, and held on to it. And then he did something that still reads as strange as today. While Alexander's body was being carried back to Macedon for burial, Ptolemy intercepted the funeral procession. Diadochi Siculus, writing a couple centuries after the fact, describes exactly this. Ptolemy met that great funeral cart with an army and peeled the most famous corpse in the world away from the men who were supposed to be carrying it home. He redirected the body into Egypt, first to Memphis, and eventually to a monumental tomb in Alexandria. And just like that, he turned a dead conqueror into the founding relic of his own regime. That single act tells you the entire plan in miniature. Ptolemy wasn't just taking territory, he was taking legitimacy and building a shrine around it. In 305 BC, he made the whole thing official and proclaimed himself Pharaoh. And notice he didn't reach for a little title like governor or satrap, or general in charge of a province. He went straight for Pharaoh, the exact word the Egyptians have used for their own rulers for nearly 3,000 years before he ever showed up. And that decision right there is the single hinge of the entire story. Alexander conquered by force and personal charisma. He watched that model die along with the men who invented it, and drew the exact opposite conclusion. The way he saw it, conquest gets you on the throne, but only administration keeps you there. So he didn't rule Egypt like an occupier, sitting on top of a defeated country. He built something designed to make ordinary Egyptians believe their new Greek king already belonged there. Here's how it actually worked. The first piece was wardrobe. Ptolemy put on a real pharaonic regalia, and he learned the religious ceremonies as a pharaoh was expected to perform. He didn't treat those ritual obligations as some foreign formality he could skip. He performed them, publicly, the same way an Egyptian king always has. The second piece was the priesthood. Egypt's temples weren't just religious buildings, they were economic and political institutions, controlling land, labor, and enormous stores of wealth. A conqueror chasing a quick, brutal profit would have looted them, and Ptolemy simply didn't. He kept the priestly class in place, funded their temples, and let them keep their power inside their own domain. In exchange, the priesthood did something that no army could ever do for him. They told the Egyptian population that this new Greek king was legitimate. The third piece was marriage. Ptolemy's dynasty adopted a practice that genuinely horrified other Greeks and Macedonians, which was sibling marriage inside the royal family. To a Macedonian aristocrat, that was scandal. To an Egyptian, it was tradition, going back centuries to the pharaohs of the new kingdom. The Ptolemies weren't improvising here. They were marching to the local drumbeat exactly, because matching the script was the whole strategy. The fourth piece is one of the most people miss, and it's the most calculated move of the entire playbook. Ptolemy and his successors basically engineered a brand new god, Serapis, a deliberate fusion of Egypt's own Osiris and the Apis sacred bull, dressed up in the form of a Greek god like Zeus. None of that was some accident of cultural drift. It was a design product, built on purpose. A god that Greeks in Alexandria could actually worship comfortably, and a god that Egyptians could recognize as their own, just wearing a Greek face. One religion, built to give two very different populations something shared at the altar. And the fifth piece was the law, running on two separate tracks at once. Greeks in Alexandria lived under Greek law. Egyptians out in the countryside, what the sources call Korah, lived under Egyptian law, with Egyptian courts, in the Egyptian language. On paper, that can sound cynical. Tool rulebooks for two classes of people. But in practice, it worked, and it kept working for 275 years, because it let each population live inside a legal framework it already recognized, instead of forcing one alien system onto everyone at once. Put all 5 of those pieces together, the regalia, the priesthood, the marriages, the engineered god, the dual legal code, and you don't have a conquest anymore. What you end up with is a state built so precisely that its subjects could look at a Greek-speaking king from Macedon and see a legitimate pharaoh sitting on the throne. And that's really the whole method right there. Alexander thought conquest was the finish line. Ptolemy proved it was only the starting gun. There's one more piece of infrastructure that he built that outlasted every king who came after him, and that's the Library of Alexandria. It wasn't a vanity project. He built it to turn Alexandria into the intellectual capital of the entire Mediterranean, the one place Greek science, philosophy, and literature all had to pass through if they wanted to matter. That's soft power, engineered just as hard as any temple or law. A city that could outthink Athens quietly became a city that nobody wanted to go to war with. Now, this is where the story stops being clean, because a dynasty built on a good system isn't the same thing as a dynasty run by good people. The founder had discipline. The descendants had appetite. And the middle Ptolemies get genuinely brutal. You've got multiple women named Bernice and Arsinoe, holding a real political power, at a scale you almost never see anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean, and not as a decoration either. They ruled, they schemed, and a few of them turned assassin when they had to. Ptolemy VIII, the one they nicknamed Physcon, the Fat One, murdered his own son and sent the pieces of the body to his sister wife as a birthday present. Our source for that is the ancient historian Justin, boiling down a much older account that's since been lost. And he's the one who hands us that detail of the dismembered boy arriving on Cleopatra II's birthday. Now, Justin is a hostile source writing long after the fact, so the staging might be sharpened up for effect. But the murder itself really isn't in any serious doubt. Then you've got Ptolemy XII, nicknamed Auletes, the flute player, who got so unpopular with his own people that he had to flee Egypt and personally bribe Roman senators just to hang onto his throne. And this is the part of the pattern that people forget when they romanticize dynasties. A system built well enough can carry spectacularly bad people for a very long time. And that isn't a compliment to the people. It's a measure of just how strong the underlying machine really was. By the 1st century BC, the Ptolemaic dynasty wasn't really surviving on its own institutional strength anymore. It was surviving because it had become useful to Rome. Egypt was too rich to simply swallow whole, because any Roman who conquered it outright would have set off a civil war back home over who got to control the wealth. So Rome left the Ptolemies on the throne, as long as Egypt played the part of client kingdom and Rome played the part of protector. That old move that started out as look Egyptian enough to satisfy the Egyptians had quietly turned into something new, stay useful enough to satisfy Rome. Same playbook, really, just a different century and a different audience to win over. Which brings us to the last of the Ptolemies, the one whose name everybody already knows, Cleopatra VII. And if you strip away the Hollywood version for a second, the real story is actually more interesting, and it lands the whole thesis of the video. By Plutarch's account, Cleopatra was the first ruler in the entire Ptolemaic line to actually bother learning the Egyptian language. Now, Plutarch is writing about a century and a half later, so he isn't exactly an eyewitness. But he's very specific about it, and he describes her moving from one tongue to the next, Ethiopian, Hebrew, Parthian, without ever needing an interpreter. Every Ptolemy before her had ruled Egypt for the better part of 3 centuries, while speaking Greek at court, and never once learning the language of the people that they were governing. Cleopatra broke that pattern, and she didn't stop there. She staged herself in public as the living reincarnation of the goddess Isis. And she played the Pharaoh role model completely, more convincingly, and with far more political intelligence than any of her ancestors ever had. This wasn't a woman using her looks as a weapon, the way that thousands of years of Roman propaganda and Hollywood scripts have flattened her into. This was the single sharpest operator in a family that had spent almost 3 centuries going soft. She didn't inherit her power. She had to outmaneuver her own siblings just to hold on to it. She allied with Julius Caesar, and then after he was assassinated, she allied with Mark Antony. And that was arithmetic, not romance. Rome had grown too big to ignore and too dangerous to fight head-on. So the only move left on the board was to tie Egypt's fate to Rome's most powerful men and hope the right one came out on top, except the wrong one did. Antony lost to Octavian at Actium in 31 BC, and about a year later, Alexandria fell. Cleopatra took her own life rather than be dragged through the streets of Rome in chains. And when Octavian took Egypt, he wasn't just taking a kingdom. He was taking the last independent link in a chain of legitimacy that ran all the way back to Ptolemy I. Egypt became a Roman province. It wasn't a partner or a client state any longer. It was just property now, owned outright. And this is the detail that closes the whole loop. Octavian, who's about to become the Emperor Augustus, walks into Alexandria as a conqueror and looks at the same temples, the same priesthood, the same religious machinery that Ptolemy had set up 300 years before. And he doesn't tear any of it down. He puts on the costumes too. Rome keeps the Egyptian priesthood in place, keeps the temples funded, lets the Egyptians go on worshiping their gods exactly the way that they always had. If you go look at the temple walls at a place like Dendera, you'll actually find the Roman emperor carved in the old style, dressed as a pharaoh, making his offerings to the Egyptian gods. Mary Beard makes this exact point about Rome in general, that the empire was usually less interested in stamping out local systems than in leaving them running with a quiet Roman hand resting on top. And Egypt is the instinct in the purest form. The conqueror studied the playbook of the conquered, and then he turned around and ran it himself. This is the whole thesis of this video. And the story isn't just proved it twice. Ptolemy took a fractured empire and made himself legitimate by wearing a crown that was already there. And Rome took Ptolemy's kingdom and did the very same thing to keep it quiet. Two different empires running the same playbook in roughly the same century, give or take 300 years. And this is where it stops being ancient history and starts sounding like current events. Every occupying power since Rome has ran into the same math that Ptolemy faced back in 323 BC. You can hold a territory by raw force and pay for it with permanent resistance. Or you can absorb the local institutions, leave the existing hierarchy mostly in place, and let the population believe nothing fundamental has actually changed. Colonial administrators in the 19th century ran this exact model. British rule in India never abolished the princely states. It kept them, funded them, and governed straight through them. William Dalrymple has written whole books on how this actually worked, how a trading company and then a crown ended up running an entire subcontinent, mostly by letting India's own rulers stay in place, keeping hundreds of them on their thrones as clients, while the real power got drawn down quietly upward. French rule in North Africa did a version of the same thing, keeping the local religious courts running right alongside French civil law, which is the exact same dual trick that Ptolemy had used with his Greek and Egyptian courts more than 2,000 years earlier. And modern financial institutions run a much quieter version of the same play. With some international lender restructures a struggling economy, it rarely replaces the local government. It keeps the flag. It keeps the president. It leaves the parliament sitting right where it is. It just rewrites who actually controls the ledger behind the curtain. The name on the throne stays exactly the same, and the machinery underneath it changes hands. And that isn't a conspiracy. It's the oldest continuity trick there is. And Ptolemy basically wrote the first draft of the manual. The lesson sitting underneath all of this is pretty simple, and it's the reason this story still matters. Power that shows up looking foreign invites resistance. Power that wears the local costumes tends to survive. Ptolemy understood that standing in the wreckage of Alexander's empire, at a moment when every other general was still fighting over raw territory, he wasn't the strongest general in that room, and he didn't need to be. What he understood, and nobody else really did, was that conquest ends, but legitimacy has to be renewed every single day, in every temple, in every court, on every coin stamped with a god the people already trusted. 275 years later, his family was finally gone, but the system he built outlived him, outlived his descendants, and got picked right up by the very empire that ended his dynasty. And that's the ledger now. The names on the throne keep changing. The playbook underneath them almost never does. This has been Hidden Forces in History. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. Do me a favor, like this video, drop us a comment, and smash the subscribe button if you want more Hidden Forces in History.